Hey there everyone, today we're going to be continuing our Thomas Pynchon secondary literature review series. This time we're going to be looking at a very interesting essay, The Sieve and the Rainbow Serpent, Bleeding Gravity's Rainbow by Dana Medoro. And I think that this essay has a very wide scope, a very interesting interpretation from someone who is not particularly steeped in literary criticism. I found this style to be very new. It connects with a lot of the French theory that I'm familiar with, people like Derrida, for example. And I think that while at times that there's a tremendous focus on kind of mythical imagery and symbolism here, and while sometimes I think the individual chain links, so to speak, are a bit tenuous, I do find the conclusion rather interesting. And this is in many ways a feminist reading of Gravity's Rainbow that develops really brilliantly in terms of understanding the way the female body, and particularly the menstrual cycle, is symbolized in Gravity's Rainbow. And I would like to further add on to this essay a connection to the Fritz Lang 1929 silent film Die Frau im Mond, or The Woman in the Moon. And this is actually mentioned in Gravity's Rainbow as the basis of the film that Gerhard von Goethe makes, which ends up reifying the Herreros going into the zone in search of the 00001 rocket, or at least the parts to build it and whatnot, and kind of acts as their condition of possibility for actually escaping out of their oppression. So I think there's actually some really interesting additional imagery that I would just like to bring out, and some symbolism that I would like to bring out, which I think is really interesting. Medoro opens by giving a definition of a sieve. It's a utensil consisting of a circular frame with a finely meshed or perforated bottom, used to separate the coarser from the finer particles of any loose material, or as a strainer for liquids. Some other connections that are made are as used by witches for sailing in. I still don't understand what that means. As used for purposes of divination. To sieve, sift, or strain is to examine, select, or separate. And then she also gives a quote from Gravity's Rainbow. Slothrop, who believes that women like Martians have antennae, men do not, keeps an eye on her. So there's a little keying in here in the beginning that maybe there is something that women have, because witches, of course, are a female figure traditionally. They have some sort of potentially secret power. And she shows us a quote from Roger Mexico, who says, "The Romans, the ancient Roman priests, laid a sieve in the road and then waited to see which stalks of grass would come up through the holes. They used the stalks that grew through the holes to cure the sick. The sieve was a very sacred item to them. What will you do with the sieve you've laid over London? How will you use the things that grow in your network of death?" And there's so much in here that she develops very brilliantly throughout her essay. We see a link between the selective capacities of the sieve to take advantage of the outliers, use them for a medicinal purpose, which connects to death, right? With this network of death having some sort of remediable quality in it. And Medoro says that for every word that seems to construct an idea or a system, another possible definition slips through. And I think a really great complement to Medoro's essay would be Deleuze and Guattari's work in A Thousand Plateaus on linguistics. The chapter titled Postulates of Linguistics is basically all about their theory of linguistics, which I've done several lectures on, and I'll be sure to leave some video links in the description that will be helpful for this. There's this assumption that Deleuze and Guattari try to go against, which says that language is normative, that it is prescriptive, that there is a proper English, for example. And they show how this attempts to be instituted through institutions like schools, for example, and through these implicit normative constraints in society, such that if you, for example, pronounce a word incorrectly or quote unquote incorrectly, you will get lambasted and you'll get corrected and whatnot. But they show that this normative capacity of language is not primary. It's something secondary that gets imposed over a field of multiplicity. And Deleuze and Guattari mention, albeit briefly in 1,000 Plateaus, the importance of something like African American vernacular English. And for those who don't know, this is a sort of scholarly linguistic term for the type of English spoken by Black Americans. And it is famously associated with the phenomenon of code switching, where someone who grows up in like the Bronx or I don't know, some kind of community like this, they will speak AAVE, African American Vernacular English, in their daily life. But say they go into a more privileged area and want to get a job, they will code switch and use the more quote unquote proper English in order to assimilate and maintain that homogeneity of the community that will allow them a way in. So there is a recognition by Deleuze and Guattari that conformity is necessary for any system of power, and that language is one of these ways to maintain that conformity. And of course, this extends beyond language into any symbolic domain. Medoro shows very brilliantly how the sieve is also viewed traditionally, especially in England and Europe, for example, as a symbol of the feminine. The feminine is often equated with a leaky barrel or a leaky sieve because you have fluids discharged from the female, such as menstrual fluids or milk while the mother is nursing. And these are stereotyped and caricatured as something deficient, something that testifies to the inability of the female body to maintain itself, almost like it's showing its impotence. And she mentions, Medoro does various paintings, for example, where the Queen of England will actually be shown with a sieve in her hand as a sort of testament to her ability to not leak, because there's a sort of contradiction in the sieve that does not leak. And this is seen as the paradoxical position of the female ruler who is able to rule. And there's actually an image in which the queen has the sieve over her genital area, really linking that symbolism together. So there is this association between the feminine and this sieving multiplicity. Think of the multiplicity of the female ability to create, right? To create the entirety of humankind through the act of birth. This allows for several different definitions of what is proper to slip through. Medoro says that while the rocket comes crashing down, forms of life grow up through sacred spaces. The paradox of the sieve, however, to which gravity's rainbow repeatedly and obsessively turns, is the fact that as a perforated object, its spaces must be punched out. Its very form requires violent composition. The sieve does not necessarily precede the bombed cities, does not layer over them, but emerges as a text within the destruction. Only then can parabola be sifted into parable by the scholar magicians of the zone. The supposition that there can be no text without a trace, incision, or hammering on a surface becomes an almost incomprehensibly violent condition when the earth itself is transformed into the stretched vellum or stone tablet. Gravity's Rainbow, then, attempts to comprehend the global warfare of the 20th century as a kind of writing. And this connects with so much because it has a lot to say about the bearing of the ideal on the message of Gravity's Rainbow. There is this understanding that, for example, in the Lozingueteries case, when they're talking about the imposition of language, this is not just simply language, but it has more dramatic implications for the way people are treated. In the case of, for example, the African-American person from the Bronx who's going to a more privileged area to get a job, their accent and their speech might actually hinder them from getting a job and being able to provide for themselves. So the link between the normative ideals, because of this ideal of the perfect English, of the singular language lacking in multiplicity, is an ideal. It's not actually real. It's something imposed secondarily. This does not precede the act of imposition which goes along with real suffering. For example, when it comes to solidifying the Nazi notion of purity, this goes along with, for example, real violence and struggle, such as the Herero genocide, which Pynchon mentions in Gravity's Rainbow, where in this case, it is seen that there is a very real link between, for example, there's all this talk about this language with a symbol that no one quite knows how to pronounce. It's something like a G, I believe, if I remember correctly. And this is a sort of imposed language that will cover up the past history of the Hereros and their suffering. This is the imposition of a text that always leaves a trace. And we see this too in Pynchon's 1997 work, Mason and Dixon, where in that case, the drawing of the line, that is the Mason and Dixon line, is equated with drawing up and instituting words on a page like the Kabbalah, where we are actually transforming Earth itself in a very real way, because we are, of course, harming the environment with humanity's effects we have on it. And thus our writing produces very real consequences, and thus this symbolism too, this sexist symbolism of the leaky sieve that comes to represent the feminine, has of course its own pernicious implications. Medoro states that the smashing force of the rocket both destroys and produces pockets of life. Its passage through space creates a passage of text as well as an entrance into new forms of conceptualization. The novel, as a kind of sifting sieve itself, is a rite of initiation into the Kabbalist contemplation of self-negating, or incompatible terms, which aims towards a moment of divine insight. And this is one of the interesting things that is going to connect to die Frau im Mond as we get into the symbolism more later, is that the rocket has a romanticization behind it. It has this phallic force of triumphing above the earth, ascending upwards into the divine heavens. But of course, the side that Pynchon also wants to show is its inevitable return back, which in a very real way is the sort of counter to every act of creation is simultaneously an act of destruction. And the sort of contradictory, the brilliant contradictory state of the height of human innovation in the form of these modern weapons technologies, such as the V2, combined with the lows of its destructive capabilities and its tremendously problematic consequences for how humans think about themselves. Now, Medoro takes a bit of a digression into understanding the Puritan themes in Gravity's Rainbow, but it circles back, you'll see why that's a pun in a moment, to this notion of cyclical history where she says that as Berkovich demonstrates, the sermons, that being of the Puritans, rest upon a symbolic economy of rebirth and ritual purification. The mixed tones of thunder and consolation in the American Jeremiad tradition partake in the elaboration of a new world of regeneration. Similarly, when Slothrop recalls that America went wrong in the name of the elect, he invokes the rhetoric of cyclical regeneration in the sermons. This time, though, it is the preterite who will show the way. His musings represent America as the Puritans did, as a route back into a second chance for spiritual innocence. And I think there's a tremendous amount of irony here, because any symbol that Pynchon uses goes both ways. Because, for example, with the Puritans seeking an escape from religious persecution and a new sense of liberation, that comes with it, of course, not just this ideal narrative, but the real analog, which is the imposition of their rule on those who were already in the Americas. And this is examined in more detail in Mason and Dixon, where the intersection between colonial ideals, for example, and this approach to America as a space of transcendence also becomes, just like the desired effects with the V2, our own downfall. So there's always a bit of an irony and a smirk when talking about this notion of returning. But this is something that, for example, Pynchon's grandfather, I think, William Slothrop, actually wrote an influential but very controversial essay on the elect versus preterite in real life. And Pynchon plays on this essay in Gravity's Rainbow and gives a sort of pseudo quote from it, in which he basically says that, look, one day maybe we'll start thanking the preterite, because without the preterite there would be no elect. And someday maybe we'll start praising Judas Iscariot as well, which I think is kind of a funny notion, really connects in here with this symbolism. Medoro states that the novel's grand cycling also occurs in the image of the sieve, the circular and porous object which opens up spaces for hope and movement through destruction. According to Maureen Quilligan, the book searches for a means of salvation. This quest, moreover, tends to cycle in and out of the multitudinous dialogues, connecting them through a dense web of correspondences. In concurrence with most critics of Gravity's Rainbow, Quilligan finds that Pynchon's vision, while tragic, is not pessimistic. The quote-unquote proper reader of this text, she says, must be someone who is willing to entertain the possibility of making a religious response to the ineffability invoked by the polysemous language. To put this assertion another way, like the sieve, an object used for purposes of divination, the polysemous density, which Quilligan locates in Gravity's Rainbow, engages interpretation as a kind of divination or holy activity. If, as Quilligan claims, the sacred and the profane intersect, the waste of the world may then be read as a source of renewable, cyclical energy. And the novel's temporal period, a gestative 9 months, signals both the ending and the beginning of a cycle. Is the cycle over now, and a new one ready to begin? Blicero asks the end of the novel. And I think that's really interesting, because there is this interesting relationship between Pynchon and the divine. Again, just as I've heard a biographer of Foucault's say that when you read Foucault, you should always imagine him with a smirk on his face, I think you can do the same thing with Pynchon. He's always sort of half-assing things, or not half-assing things, but he's always kind of trying to make you doubt your own sanity. but in a way that opens you up to, for example, the possibility, as Quilligan says, of making a religious response. And of course, what that word means, Pynchon kind of tries to break down by providing this continuum between the purely secular, deterministic people like Pointsman in Gravity's Rainbow, all the way through various esoteric practices, things like the occult in the form of tarot. You also have witchcraft, and then you have all the way over to traditional notions of religious imagery. So because you have this full perspective of the religious, I really think he's trying to show the porosity of that category. And I think Medoro makes a really, really cool connection here, that the characters also partake in another quote-unquote holy activity, drug experimentation, as they seek out epiphantic moments. The two activities link up in the image of the sieve. While the rocket splinters the earth into new messages, what survives or pushes through its cracks to return to the Reverend's emblematic sieve is medicinal. The proliferation of drugs, from benzodrine to reefer in Gravity's Rainbow, locates the search for a cure for the world's annihilating pain in the concept of the Word as antidote, the Word made flesh as antibody. The mind-altering dope, which the world's preterite exchange among themselves in the shelled spaces of the zone, creates hallucinations or visions of other orders, as well as underground communities. Its illegal status, imposed by state powers, testifies to its creative potential. And I think that's really interesting because that kind of connects again to Die Frau im Mond. Because what we have here is in Die Frau im Mond, there is a rumor, I believe, that gold is on the moon. Or maybe they have even located gold on the moon. They just need to go get it. And a number of the characters team together, and throughout all of this kind of romantic melodrama, for example, because the main character, the main male character, and the main female character kind of fall in love throughout this, and the main male character, I believe his name is Helios, or maybe it's Wendiger, but I think it's Helios, is trying to kind of get the girl the whole time and do what's right for her. And in the same way that you have this stereotype of the man trying to get die Frau, you also have humanity trying to capture the moon, and there is this fervor that you see in Die Frau im Mond with the masculine capacity to transcend above the earth with this phallic object that is the V2. And as many commentators have noted, the style and construction of the rocket in Die Frau im Mond doubtless influenced the design of the V2 or A4 rocket. So in this same way, we are trying to ascend above the preterite, but as is typical for Gravity's Rainbow, there is two sides to this coin. Like I said, this splintering of the earth, as Medoro puts it, is going to come with some challenges and some unfortunate consequences for humans, because this is something that the accelerationists key into, I must say, is the importance of, for example, an act of profound destruction as maybe something even necessary in order to talk about a genuine future of liberation. Medoro continues that temporary alliances are knit and undone, and that's a quote from Gravity's Rainbow. She says that the pun on grass in the Reverend's description of the Roman rite becomes evident once Pynchon's characters start smoking it. And I think that's really funny, right? Because grass is another name for marijuana, and that really links this notion of drugs and medicinal things with the grass which flows through the sieve. She mentions, for example, to kind of add into this notion of the imagery and the symbolism, a quote from Pynchon from Gravity's Rainbow. This is on page 571. The word made printer's ink, dwelling along with antibodies and iron-bound breath and a good man's blood. with its cold, cutting edge, slicing away every poor illusion of comfort of the bourgeois, takes for real. She says that in the figuration of a cutting edge or matrix through which illusions must pass, the word becomes a sieve, a filtration system of the blood. And Medoro wants to put a lot of emphasis on Pynchon's wordplay. I'm really interested to go back to Gravity's Rainbow and try to find that wordplay a lot. I think she maybe exaggerates Pynchon's playing with wordplay a little bit much. There is definitely some, and we're about to get into one of the really cool ones that I just did not notice the first time I read Gravity's Rainbow. But I think if you compare him to someone like Joyce, even in Ulysses, but especially in Finnegan's Wake, that's just a whole nother level of wordplay. So maybe I'm just tainted by my Joyce loving, but I think that maybe Medoro is kind of overemphasizing the focus on the porosity of language. But nevertheless, there is, and you can look at the previous lecture on Pynchon's postmodernism in this series, you can see, for example, that one of the things played with is this ambivalent relationship, or this kind of ambiguous relationship between real description and metaphorical imagery. Medoro states that in Pynchon's diagnosis, the problem is finding a release that does not move in another, infinitely less entertaining direction of death. What we need to consider, the text reveals, is the real addiction to a culture of death, to the comforts and so-called necessities designed by men whose only talent is for death. The leaves of grass that grow in the spaces produced by the war's bombs may be additive, but they may also be the leaves of a text of life, a text formally rendered invisible by other more subtle forms of state sadism. And this connects in a really interesting way to Deleuze and Guattari again, where they talk about one of the problems when it comes to capital's reign over contemporary life is that it is able to engender into the economy these profound discontinuities. It's able to change and adapt to all sorts of forces and naturally extract profitability from any action. But with this, capital follows the axiomatic, which they call the abstract line of death, which is to say that just like the German war machine kind of barrels down to the very limits of its defeat, kind of the V2 is emblematic of this, towards its own death, there is a sort of death drive built into this need to sink to this addiction to death. This is, of course, one of those famous quotes from Gravity's Rainbow where Slothrop may be in love, sexual love with his and his race's own death, I believe is how the quote goes, where you have this obsession with the easy solutions, which profit is a very easy solution. It's very easy to just look at the kind of immediate effects of power and money and success, but then forget about, for example, the inevitable implications that Pynchon is playing on with, for example, the destruction of the environment and humanity itself. And I really love the way that Medoro emphasizes the link between God and drug in this little section from page 702 of Gravity's Rainbow. And she cites the Penguin edition here from, I think, the late 70s or early 80s. I can't exactly remember. But there's this pun between thiophosphate, which is corrected to theophosphate, indicating the presence of God. Initiation into the bodyhood of steel. No way to separate this from theophosphate. And I think that's really interesting because it connects these sort of, for example, they're talking about these benzene rings, which are used by IG Farben, this company that produces chemicals and produced also Zyklon B, the gas used in the gas chambers in the Nazi concentration camps. There's this link between this sort of pure chemistry, quote unquote, which is totally unbiased, which Pynchon, of course, shows that a perfectly seemingly legitimate company that produces this Imipex G plastic in Gravity's Rainbow, which is a part of the V2 rocket in Gravity's Rainbow, also can produce Cyclone B, this, again, link between the ideal objectivity and just pure profitability of companies and science and the reality of some of the after effects that can occur here. But this notion of thiophosphate links this chemistry and drug talk with that of the Eucharist, right? This initiation into the bodyhood of steel links with the notion of the Eucharist as the body of Christ, right? And it also links to the very end of Gravity's Rainbow, where we see the character Gottfried, meaning God and peace, actually infused into the nose cone of the rocket and then shot with the rocket to his inevitable death. So there is a link between the proposed transcendence of the rocket and of God and of drugs with the inevitable kind of steel suicide that is the V2, which I think is really interesting. Medoro states, the epidermic needle, the bodyhood of steel, punctures the skin's surface like the rocket punctures that of the earth, to bring about another order of consciousness. It partakes in a theology that places at its center a vision of redemption, of spiritual healing in the puncture wounds of a crucified God. The punctured body of Christ, stretched on the cross, becomes the mystery of the sieve that sifts together curse and cure, death and life. The bleeding holes are evidence of both an end and a beginning, of a return to original sin and a vanquishment of it. The Word as flesh is iconographically porous, weaving together the sacred and the profane. And I must admit that when we have this talk of the rocket as a sort of, about a theology of spiritual healing, redemption, part of me thinks, well, Pynchon's whole point is to show that this is this sort of idealist spinning of a narrative that kind of ignores the profound, deadly consequences of the V2 rocket, for example. You have this kind of tongue-in-cheek quote, which serves as the epigraph to open Gravity's Rainbow, where Werner von Braun talks about the spiritual continuity of our existence after death, which has been assured to him by all of his understanding of science. It's very tongue-in-cheek considering that Werner von Braun was a terrible guy that helped create this V2 rocket, which killed thousands of people in warfare and tens of thousands of people in its production in concentration camps. So this notion of the transcendence of the Word made flesh, I think that's very explicit in, for example, Gottfried, a flesh being infused with the bodyhood of steel that is the V2 at the end of the novel. It's sort of ironic, right? Now, Medoro links Pynchon's work to that of Michel de Certeau, and I would also link it to Deleuze and Guattari. If you read, for example, Ian Buchanan, a well-known Deleuze and Guattari scholar, he himself sees a very profound similarity between de Certeau and D&G. But there's this focus on the ways in which the investigation of the multiplicity of language shows the impotence of every system, and in particular of every linguistic system, because there's always gaps or spaces, which Medoro links to the gaps in a sieve. And she says that under the threatening arch of the rocket, which seals the link, the progressive nodding into, that's a quote from Gravity's Rainbow, between liftoff and target, The limericks, paradoxes, and puns serve perhaps as the disentanglement from the terror of screaming into silence. Mixture and dissemination in Gravity's Rainbow take place under the rocket's parabola. The combinations of words and people produce a kind of alchemical formulation that transmutes despair into its opposing term, hope. The god who oversees the world of Gravity's Rainbow is perhaps Thoth, ancient predecessor of Christ. Thoth is the god-pharmacist magician, as Derrida's famous deconstruction of the pharmacon in Dissemination illuminates for us, who presides over alchemy, writing, hidden text, astrology, and who can heal the sick. For Derrida, Thoth is also the deity of the passage between opposites and of crossroads. Quote, sly, slippery, and masked, he is present in the signifier that refuses to be pinned down. Medoro says that he is present in Slothrop. Often disguised and impossible to capture, Slothrop at one point, the main character of Gravity's Rainbow, becomes a crossroad himself. And now, in the zone, later in that day, he became a crossroad after a heavy rain he doesn't recall. That's from Gravity's Rainbow. Pynchon's principal character is forced through a sieve. He disseminates, scatters, and his identity is detached from the solid and steel erection of the rocket. And I think this links very directly with the philosophy of Gilles Deleuze and Félix Guattari. This liberating power of free multiplicity, of seeing beneath the ideal narratives of, for example, the rocket and its proposed transcendence, and, this association with profit and prosperity and the purity of the human race. Below this, you see the pernicious undertones, but also you see gaps which have yet to be filled. Such that, for example, this Herero tribe from Southwest Africa, which has been genocided by the Nazis in real life and in Gravity's Rainbow, actually comes via a film based on Die Frau im Mond to, in the book, come and seek its revenge, its liberatory uprising. As Medoro states, Thoth's domain extends through the pharmacon, the poison that is also a remedy. Right, this links with drugs. A magical liquid, its power lies in ambiguity, reversibility, transformation, in the flux or threshold between healing and harming, good and evil. Gravity's Rainbow, a novel spilling over with references to poisons and cures, is enveloped in the pharmacon's suspicious powers. The pharmacon appears as the distilled drug that grows through the war's sieve, as that which is addictive and liberating, painful and beneficent at once. And I think that's really important because in Die Frau im Mond, if you watch the film, which I will leave a link to in the description, by the way, as well as, showing you things on screen, there is this hope for the transcendence of the rocket to deliver gold and riches and prosperity to the characters. But in fact, it ends with the main character Helios and, as it turns out, the woman character, which I can't believe I can't remember her name, actually staying behind because their oxygen tanks have been damaged such that the ship can't sustain all of them back to Earth. So they are actually left to just wallow in the failure of their project. And yet, it ends on a hopeful message. The piano accompaniment has the love theme of the two play underneath them, and there is this sense of relief that they are together, finally, even if they are condemned to be preterite now. This is one of the most brilliant passages in Medoro's essay. Gravity's Rainbow consistently foregrounds images of regeneration within destruction. According to Mircea Eliade, a cyclical cosmology is optimistic. Suffering has meaning because it signifies renewal rather than finality. An apocalyptic, eschatological ideology has not always existed. Its coefficient of irreversibility emerges with the belief in one controlling God, a masculine God who consolidates sacred energies. The biblical consolidation of teaching by a religious elite, as Eliade demonstrates, banishes the worship of goddesses like Baal or Astarte, declares their cyclical energies illegitimate. And yet the pre-biblical ideologies of cycle and return do not conceive of a straight line towards apocalypse. What Christianity accomplishes, Eliade continues, is an ontological order of human individualism. Each individual is concerned with his or her own salvation. Each partakes in a limited, profane existence. Conversely, in an ontology of cyclical time, collective identity cradles those individuals lost to death and destruction. Human life and death form a microcosmic link to planetary rhythms. In such quote-unquote primitive religions, the human and divine realms are not split apart. Rather, an economy of circulating sacred energy gathers them together. Theirs is a world of periodic regeneration and biocosmic rhythms. And this is featured very prominently in Gravity's Rainbow because the Herero tribe actually have some mythology, which Medoro will get into later in this essay, regarding the cyclical nature of time and also the Ouroboros imagery, which keeps coming back. And they actually come to get their revenge. These underprivileged cultures, which have been genocided, which have been dealt very real violence, actually come back to take their revenge, such that the ideal shows itself to have at least a partially dialectical opposite to come back and offset it. Where the 0 and the 1, for example, cancel out or are two halves of this cyclical cycle. Now, in order to take the sieve metaphor and symbolism even further, Medoro links the symbolism of color in Gravity's Rainbow, particularly that of red, which is supposed to symbolize blood, but also menstrual blood, as well as the black and white symbolism in Gravity's Rainbow. And the black and white is obvious because, of course, this connects to race categories. It also connects to the color that the V2 rocket is painted. White comes to symbolize purity, idealism, and blackness comes to represent nightmares, feces, the devil, the predator itself. But the red, she gives some very interesting examples where the red starts to emerge and cluster around cyclical and circular images. For example, it's the drastic stain of a sunset, the primal red of the presence of the Creator much more direct, and these are all various quotes. The shade of red ring manacles and of the sacrificed Gottfried's nipples. It's also the blood of our enemies and the blood of our friends. And that, of course, is very interesting because blood is in, for example, communion, where the sacrifice and death of Christ is also linked with his subsequent rising above death. So you can see that there is that hope, at least for Pynchon, that beyond the death drive of the rocket, there is something else. She states, and this is based off of a study, The Curse, A Cultural History of Menstruation, in which there is a link between the colors white, red, and black, with red notably in the middle as a mediator between these two terms, in which it's argued that this triad of colors is associated with the eternal feminine life cycle, the whiteness of the new moon, through to the red full moon, and then to the decline of the old and blackened moon. And this, of course, is important because this connects to die Frau im Mond, or moon, right? where we actually have the feminine and the moon linked together. Because in the same way that Helios in Die Frau im Mond is trying to get this feminine character the whole time, he's trying to get what he sees as rightfully his and what has belonged to him all the time, because she's in sort of a marriage where maybe she doesn't really love it, or actually they're engaged, they're soon to be married. And yet, the moon comes to symbolize as well this desired feminine character, that it has been ours all along, that it's our job to go and get it. It's very manifest destiny-like. And this is the sort of thing that Pynchon plays off of in Gravity's Rainbow. He kind of critiques this notion of the transcendence of, these are like colonial messages, right? Now, Medoro links all of this to the notion of the Ouroboros, or this cycling snake that is biting its own tail. And she says that almost every culture, including the African Herero, the tribe in Gravity's Rainbow, has a snake and rainbow myth that consolidates life and death and represents rebirth following a kind of mass swallowing by water. Many cultures attribute the origin of the world to the rainbow snake. As a symbol of the birth of human culture, Knight argues, it is inseparable from menstrual synchrony. And when I read, for example, this section, it's filled with some kind of tenuous symbolic jumps, like I mentioned, but it's a fun idea nonetheless, and it gets more plausible as we get on. But for example, this idea of consolidating life and death following a mass swallowing by water, I don't know why Medoro didn't think to connect this mass swallowing by water to submersion in amniotic fluid. That is the fate of a gestating child, right? They're inside the mother's womb, and they're slowly forming, and from this preterite position, from this dark position in which they are engulfed in blackness, they kind of escape out. But, then as you say that, Pynchon also kind of wants to play on that and say, well, no, sometimes it's not just escaping the black, right? Because that desire kind of comes to haunt Gerhard von Goethe, who is literally chased by this black Herero tribe, which have come rightfully to get back their land and get this 00001 rocket. And she gives a quote from Gravity's Rainbow from page 726 of the Penguin edition, which really kind of consolidates all of the imagery together. The rocket does lead the way, among others, past these visible serpent coils that lash up above the surface of the earth in rainbow light, in steel tetany. These storms, these things of earth's deep breast we never told, past them through the violence to a numbered cosmos. Right? And you can see in here the cyclical cycle of the rainbow serpent and the deep vicissitudes of the Earth's breast, contrasted with the rocket that leads the way past the serpent. This masculine transcendence above, but at the expense of, the female preterite, which is seen as profane, just in the way that, for example, she mentioned the association of the leaky female imagery, right? And she mentions, for example, the dream of Kekulé, one of the Hereros, who has a dream that the serpent announces that the world is a closed thing, cyclical, resonant, eternally recurring. But the system has lost this vision, has converted the eternally returning coiled serpent into a destructive benzene ring. And this benzene ring is used for the construction of Imiplex G by IG Farben, and also represents, for example, their ability to use chemistry in the production of the Zyklon B toxin. She continues that the mass suicide of the Herero tribe occurs because they are split off from the old tribal unity, a unity connected to menstruation. They embrace death through abortion and a pact to calculate no cycles, no returns. And she gives an important note here that the Herero resistance to German colonization occurs as a refusal to reproduce. It is a racial suicide, relying upon menstruation as a sign of progression to a negative birth rate. While menstruation is not directly spoken, its surrounding symbolic economy is extensively laid out. The bloodlines of mother and father, the sacred birth knot, this is all from Gravity's Rainbow, the moon's true message, the sunset's blood and rebirth in the sky every morning. And Medoro kind of synthesizes all this together by saying rainbows and the rainbow snake, when they are glimpsed or apprehended, signify sources of hope in the terrifying destruction. For instance, forms of communication hidden from Lothrop have, quote, rainbow edges rippling most intense. Seaman Bodine's subversive garment, his enormous zoot suit, is rainbow-colored. Katja Borgesius wears a rainbow-striped dirndl skirt of satin, which shimmers underneath the skylight. Pan, a member of the spirits we are not supposed to be seeing, enters the scene as a, quote, beautiful serpent, its coils in rainbow lashings in the sky. Medoro writes, "It is my contention that these multiple allusions to rainbows inhere in the text's menstrual economy, that which the totalizing power of the destructive masculine rocket technology tries to contain and distort. The snake mythology of menstrual synchrony combines life and death in an endless rhythm, like the, quote, interface in the life cycle which Enzian observes, its long rainbow, and part of an older, longer way of knowing and surviving. The rocket's parabolic arc, however, is an imitation, a perversion of the rainbow. It hides the vision of the rainbow and snake that actually circle the earth. It is the circle cut in half. The dreaming serpent surrounds the world, cradles the world, while the rocket's arc proclaims its devastation. We should not be inclined by this vision, the narrator insists. The rainbow requires us to see through the rocket's screaming announcement of power." And this is a quote from Gravity's Rainbow. "Not, as we might imagine, bounded below by the line of the earth it rises from, and the earth it strikes. No, but then you never really thought it was, did you? Of course, it begins infinitely below the earth, and goes on infinitely back into earth. It's only the peak that we are allowed to see, the breakup through the surface, out of the other silent world." End quote. Another circular image, the Earth's rainbow, struggles against brainless men without vision, without imagination. Like the serpent, it is a phallic symbol, to borrow Chris Knight's words, only within the context of male rule. And this is kind of blended together brilliantly in Gravity's Rainbow to explain, for example, the mindset of the Germans in the early 20th century who have lost World War I. They have been asked to pay reparations that they can't feasibly pay. Their currency, the Reichsmark, has started to inflate dramatically. There's all sorts of political upheaval. And as a result, Enzian, the Herero, funnily enough, looks for Rocket 00001 as the hope that his people can take to the moon. And this is, of course, connecting again to die Frau im Mond. This is a quote from Gravity's Rainbow. "The history of the old Hereros is one of lost messages. It began in mythical times when the sly hare who nests in the moon brought death among men. Inside of the moon's true message. The true message has never come. Perhaps the rocket is meant to take us there someday. And then moon will tell us its truth at last." And of course, this seems a bit ironic in light of Die Frau im Mond, because of course they are going to search for gold there on the moon, and when they do, it sort of devolves into chaos. By the end of the book, most of the characters have been shot or killed in some form. The kind of mad scientist character who has the manuscript which allows for them to make the plans to fly to the moon, he finds gold, and then he falls and dies. So there's a sort of irony here in which we're speaking of this feminine lost or parallel world or energy that's hidden in this forbidden domain. It's filled with this sort of masculinist kind of understanding of the feminine mystique. But then, of course, what is the reality behind this stereotype? In terms of gender, it is just a stereotype. And in terms of the way the symbolism is used, for example, that the rocket, this phallic symbol, is meant to transcend above the preterite Earth and go to the moon to deliver us, it results in this kind of sad outcome. Medoro says that connected to blood, the moon emerges in the night sky each night to attack the sun until its blood runs out over the horizon and sky. That's from Gravity's Rainbow. The bloody sunset signifies the end of one day and the beginning of the next. In the symbolic symbol of menstruation, the moon is a clock which initiates humanity into a collective rhythm. In synchrony with the moon, women's bodies are timekeepers and sources of ritual power. Menstruation means moon change all over the world. It is the sign of humanity's survival and interconnection. And that is definitely something that Pynchon is trying to talk about. These interconnected cycles, that power has actual ramifications for example, these cycles of the Earth's environment and potentially making them cease in the future. It leads to this active spilling of blood. It is part of this symbolic system of menstruation in which there is this collective rhythm. But the opposite side of this coin is it is a collective rhythm of a death drive that is reified through the V2 rocket. Now, Medoro does want to give a positive interpretation of this female energy, and I really think that she gives a compelling point here. She says that the fact that two of the characters refer to menstruation when recalling an event draws the symbolism together and gestures towards its deployment in the text. Franz Pöckler, for instance, remembers sleeping with Lenny 2 weeks since her last period. And Gelly Tripping tells Slothrop, "I've been up there every Walpurgisnacht since I had my first period." Furthermore, Gelly is a sorceress, an apprentice witch from some otherworldly place. In Gravity's Rainbow, this young menstruating woman takes Slothrop in and tells him to, quote, flow along with the suspended rules of the zone. She wanders in the moonlight, thinking about love. She is the world-choosing sort of witch who searches for Chicherin. And when she finds him, she resolves to purge, to bleed him of his hatred for his black half-brother Enzian. Her magic potion dissolves the murder plot against Chicherin's memory in the face of Enzian's face. And I really think that's quite brilliant, because even in Die Frau im Mond, this film that is filled with masculinist stereotypes, who is the one who decides to actually make the free choice at the end of the movie but the main female character? Because, for example, Helios and Windiger are the two kind of competing men over the Frau, and they end up drawing sticks to see who's going to stay behind. And Windiger has to stay behind, but Helios actually drugs Windiger and thinks that he has drugged the woman as well, and tells a young boy who has accompanied them on their trip that now you have to bring us back, right? This is sort of going to be taken advantage of with the Nazis when they have these young groups of boys who are taught to, you're going to be the next men, we're going to raise you like men and do the virtuous and righteous thing and help us achieve our transcendence in this war effort. That's sort of implicit there. And yet when Helios stays behind on the moon and thinks he's alone, who decides to make the free choice and stay with him but the main female character? So there is a little bit of a feminist message in both Gravity's Rainbow and Die Frau im Mond. Medoro continues, like Gelly, Katja, who has the moon in the soles of her feet, also plays a witch's role. It is when Slothrop curls up with her in a red tablecloth, where it's cozy and just as red as a womb in here, that he begins his passage away from a singular identity associated with the rocket and its technology. In the fluid discourse of menstruation, there are many selves that modulate in a movement of life and death. Like the magical pharmacon's play of oppositions, menstrual blood is a substitute that can renew and transform itself. Slothrop's gradual disappearance or dissemination recalls Katya's words, "I don't think they know about other selves, yours or the rocket's." If we can sift through language like through a sieve, through the womb-like matrix of writing, to quote Derrida, the malleable part will leak through and leave the sedimentation of thought and identity on the other side. And by this point, I'm much more convinced of Medoro's message, that this really is talking about a fundamental fluid discourse that undergirds the ideal narratives of those in power. And the link between the moon and the womb and red here all comes together very brilliantly with the cyclical renewal energy of the Ouroboros, and the rainbow serpent. So that being said, I hope that this has been interesting, given you some food for thought. Check out any of the other lectures in this series in which we do secondary literature review of academic works on Thomas Pynchon. That being said, check out any of my other lectures I've done on postmodernism, German idealism, gender theory, post-colonial studies, and other literature. You can become a channel member for $5 a month and gain access to, among other things, a monthly private philosophy Zoom. I also have super thanks available if you just want to donate to the channel, because I'm a poor college student and I'd appreciate anything you have to give. That being said, that's it for this lecture, and I will see you in another one.